There we go. So my name is Jordan Swain Fox. I'm the outreach coordinator for CURA at Ohio State, and we're glad to have you here today for our last webinar in the series, Is AI Sustainable? And this series has been co-sponsored by CURA, Sustainability Institute, and the Translational Data Analytics Institute at Ohio State. So today we're glad to have Mark Partridge here, who will discuss if data centers are an effective tool for community engagement and development too. Just a few logistical items before we dive right into it. If you require closed captioning today, you'll find a box at the bottom of the screen labeled CC. You can click this box and select Show Subtitles. You'll also notice chat is disabled. So if you have questions for our speaker, you can use the Q&A box, and we'll share those towards the end of the webinar. I'll also note that this event is approved for one AICP CM credit. After this webinar, you can claim your CM credits by logging into your My APA account and entering the event into your online CM event log. You'll notice that we have a survey that will pop up at the end of the webinar and would love for you to provide your feedback via that link at the end of the presentation. You can learn about our future events at cura.osu.edu. We have another webinar series starting next month that Harvey will touch on at the end. And you can also learn more about Sustainability Institute and TDAI at si.osu.edu and tdai.osu.edu, respectively. So with that, I'll turn it over to Harvey to introduce Mark, and we'll get started.
Okay, thank you very much, Jordan, and welcome everybody to our final event in our webinar series for spring 2025, Is AI Sustainable?, where we've looked at the impact locally, globally, on AI and data centers, and today we'll talk about whether or not this is a good data centers are a good economic development policy. So joining us today, we have Professor Mark Partridge. He is a professor in the College of Food, Agriculture, and Environmental Sciences at The Ohio State University, where he also served as the Swank Chair of Rural-Urban Policy from 2006 to 2024. Professor Partridge is a regional economist who focuses on community and regional economics, development and growth, rural-urban interdependence, and the geography of poverty and local labor markets. Professor Partridge is a consultant with the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. He served for 12 years as editor of the Journal of Regional Science and is on several other academic journal editorial boards. He has published over 200 academic journal papers and 70 other book chapters, briefs, and reports, including co-authoring the book, The Geography of American Poverty: Is There a Role for Place-Based Policy? Professor Partridge frequently gives presentations and addresses to academic and practitioner groups around the world. He has consulted with the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland, and various governments in the US and Canada, as well as the European Commission. He has presented to the US Congress and the Canadian Parliament on regional issues. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Professor Partridge. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Harvey, and thank you, Jordan, for having me today. Harvey gave a great introduction there. I'll just note a couple little things about myself. Is that I became interested in economic development back when I was in high school. That would have been around 1980. I wrote a master's thesis on 1987 on basically the topic we're going to be talking about today, in that should the U.S. use industrial policy or policies that favor particular industries. And in this case, back in the late 1980s, just like today, history might rhyme, but sometimes it's identical. Should we be subsidizing certain kinds of high tech? I'll put that in quotation marks. Like today, semiconductors. If data centers would have existed, that would have been part of the argument. I was really excited about that argument, and I argued that, oh, this is a very good idea. We should subsidize these things. And then I would say, after 40 years of research and experience in economic development, I've become very jaded on the role of incentives and subsidies, which I'll talk about today. And then I will talk about it in a general sense. Say, here in Ohio, has this worked? and then I'll talk about data centers in particular. So with that, I will start here. If you'll let me share. There we go. All right. I think, yes, there you go. Okay. So as Harvey said, I should correct him. I'm an emeritus professor right now. And my main affiliation is now with as a senior research affiliate at the Ohio River Valley Institute, a public policy institute, especially interested in energy. And since data centers suck up a lot of energy, they're also interested in that. Though I want to caution that I am not reflecting the Ohio River Valley Institute necessarily, though probably much of what I'll say they would agree with. So with that, let me give you a little bit of an outline of what I'll be talking about. First, I need to outline how data centers, and it's going to very closely tie into, say, Intel and other high tech, this notion of silicon, silicon heartland and so forth. I want to talk about how that fits into basically, it's just a continuation of the same Ohio economic development strategy that dates back to Governor Rhodes's early efforts that began in the late 1970s that eventually attracted Honda here in 1982. So with that, how does data centers fit in? Well, first we have to understand do these things make sense? So first thing I want to know is newsflash, some good news. Given what Ohio has been trying to do with economic development policy, Ohio has been remarkably successful in doing what they say they want to do in economic development policy for decades. The question is, has that in turn, this success, which I'll describe here in a second, has that in turn led to widespread economic prosperity in Ohio over the last several decades? And the answer is well, what have we done? Well, basically, we have focused on manufacturing. I know data centers is a little bit different, but the key thing that's in common is they're large facilities. We're trying to track large facilities, usually in manufacturing, with large tax incentives and other kinds of subsidies and so forth. And so what we'll hear from, say, Today, Jobs Ohio, or Ohio politicians, and this would be both parties, and their predecessors in both parties, is that they've been successful. They have been wildly successful at bringing in, I'm sorry, I have an angry cat with me, just hissed at me. We've been wildly successful at bringing in these large facilities that we've incentivized. However, as I'll talk about, that has not led to broad-based prosperity. In other words, the policy, we've been successfully doing the policy, but the policy has been ineffective at creating broad-based prosperity in Ohio. So as I'll talk about, Ohio's job and population growth lingers near the bottom of the U.S. Per capita income also lags. Ohio was kind of a above average in that middle per capita income, say 35, 40 years ago. And now we're below average. We're now, say, about in the top of the bottom third or so in there. And so how do we hear about perspectives? We'll hear typically things like, oh, we just attracted a large facility and we're going to get a $20 billion investment. And that was Intel. Now they say 28 billion. Or we're going to get a data center. It's going to be a $3 billion investment. In other words, the way they're tallying success is how much was invested? How many dollars were invested? Excuse me. So the issue with that is okay, well, it's indirect. That's not what Ohioans want. We're not sitting around saying, hey, we want jobs. I don't really care if there's investment. This investment isn't creating jobs. It isn't exactly what we want. And so the way I tell it, kind of the analogy I use is be like in football. Uh, our politicians and economic development officials are typically saying, oh, we're getting all this investment. Well, that'd be like if you take a bad football team like the Chicago Bears, 5-12. And then instead, they were claiming wild success because they had more first downs than everybody. Instead of looking at the score, they were looking at first downs. And so they could have more first downs than the Packers and lose 42-7 and declare wild success. And the issue is no, we're not it. It's the people don't really care about first downs. They want to see victories. They don't care about the size of the investment. They want to see how many jobs it creates. And one of the things is that a dollar of investment across industries does not pay off equally in terms of how many jobs each dollar of investment will create. So you take an industry like the oil and gas industry, which say, I don't know how you measure it, around 10 times more capital intensive. It takes 10 times more capital, machines and so forth, equipment, uh, per worker than the average in the economy. And so that means to get the same number of jobs as you would on average, you have to have 10 times more investment in the oil and gas industry to get the same number of jobs you would get on average with a normal investment through the economy. Well, data centers is a lot like that. I mean, they don't employ very many people. A large data center may employ 100 people. I know there's a construction phase, but that's temporary jobs. What we need is permanent jobs. And so they're not creating a lot of jobs, but boy, are they filled with a lot of capital. They have a lot of high-tech machinery, a lot of computing capacity, especially for artificial intelligence. And they they don't create per dollar investment. They don't create a lot of jobs. So if you're going to get a lot of investment, you're going to need an incredible amount of investment to have that pay off. The other feature about it is these investments tend to be with large firms, large existing firms. One of the reasons why this would be anywhere in the world. I talk to people in Brazil or Europe or in Asia, and it'd be the same stories that you're subsidizing large firms because the politicians want a ribbon cutting in a large firm. And look at all these jobs. On the other hand, if it was a couple hundred small business openings, one of those aren't going to be very sexy. They create 3, 4, 5 jobs, let's say. However, what that overlooks is it may look very good in the photo op, but in terms of the local economy, small businesses, new businesses create about twice as many spillover jobs per job in the existing business. And so, in other words, a large firm will typically create about a half a job per every job that they create, where a small business will create nearly 3 jobs in total, nearly 3 jobs or 2 jobs outside of the small business. In other words, they're creating twice as many jobs throughout the economy per job that they create. And so small businesses are actually a better engine of growth. And indeed, disproportionately, small businesses and new businesses create more jobs in the economy than large businesses do. And they also have more innovation, and they buy things locally. The other feature, small businesses, one of the reasons why they have a bigger local impact is the profits stay local. With data centers, those profits are going to Google and then on out to corporate stockholders and equity holders around the world. So those profits are dispersed. And so small businesses keep them here. So with data centers, you're not going to get, like any other large firm, you're not going to get as many spillovers, with the big reasoning being that the profits don't stay local. The other feature is that even if you have higher paying jobs, that does not necessarily imply that you have more local spending that creates more jobs. And the reason why that is wealthier individuals tend to spend their money in ways that are outside the local economy. They take vacations in Europe. They buy neat Jaguar cars that are built elsewhere. While more middle income or lower income jobs, a lot of that's just spent locally. So generally they have about the same impact in terms of job creation. So you have all these features going on that give data centers a significant disadvantage in terms of what they create. They don't create very many jobs. So I'll talk more about that, but let me, I made a lot of claims here. Let me give you some evidence. So I got a bunch of these graphs. Let me see. Okay, I'll do this one right here. What this shows is benchmark to 100. How many jobs did the U.S., Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Wisconsin create? In other words, if you go up to 105, that means you created 5% more jobs than what you had in 2011. You see a lot of lines, And one of the things is I always tell my research assistant, try to pick colors that represent the major university. And unfortunately, a very nice research assistant, a Korean, does not know that we have scarlet and gray here in Ohio. And so instead we have blue, light blue. So what you'll see here is going back to 2011, that's roughly when the economy started recovering from the Great Recession. And you see the US has created nearly 25% more jobs than what they were in 2011. We see our Midwest Great Lakes and our other neighbors like PA and West Virginia, they're definitely way lagging the US. In terms of Ohio, that's that blue line right here, right there. That's Ohio. The darker blue is the US. And you see for Ohio, we've created about 10 percentage points less jobs since the Great Recession ended than the US. Depending on the year, we might be doing better than our neighbors, worse than our neighbors. Going back to 2011, we're about right in the middle. If you go back to, see if I can find it. God, I can't find it. I'll go with this one instead. You go back to 2020. When COVID began, you see all the big drop in employment. The U.S. is again up here. Ohio, since COVID, has lagged the U.S. by about 5 percentage points. If you instead start in 2021, Ohio doesn't look very good at all. And so in this era, when we've had an incredible number of announcements, we're going to have this factory, and we're going to have these data centers, and we're going to be Silicon Heartland, and all these other things, Ohio's economic performance that's what we should be keeping our eye on. And we're not just creating data centers because we love them. We're creating data centers. We're subsidizing them so that we can help broad-based prosperity. We're lagging. We're lagging. Even though we're investing a lot of money, these tax breaks. It's not like the tooth fairy pays for tax breaks. That money could have been spent for a lot of other things. They could have been spent for lower taxes. They could have been spent for education. They could have been spent for healthcare. They could have been spent on infrastructure. In other words, we shouldn't be measuring, oh, look, we get a data center and the tooth fairy gave it to us. We got a data center with all these tax incentives, and we gave up the opportunity to have lower taxes. We gave up the opportunity to have more investments in education, healthcare, infrastructure. So the comparison should be not to the tooth fairy. It should be to what we gave up with those tax incentives that we could have got without them. And I'll talk about some of the other things we give up when we have invested tax incentives with a lot of large firms. So here is the US. This is total employment, non-farm, total employment, going back to January 2015. I apologize for the awful graph. That's from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It's not pretty, but it gives me the information I want. Boom, 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 boom. You can see COVID. Employment falls about 20 million people right away. Then we get a recovery nationally. And today we have about 160 million jobs. So I want you to 160 million jobs, just to give you a feel for how many jobs we have in the US economy. In terms of Ohio, we have a little under 6 million jobs. So to put that in perspective, the US has gained somewhere around 25-30% jobs, closer to, I think, closer to 30% since late 1998. And Ohio's gained about 0.1, 0.3%. In other words, we're barely above 1998, despite the, the growth in population, the growth in the labor force that naturally around the country has caused employment to go up. So our strategy of which has been very successful of attracting large firms with tax incentives has not led to broad-based prosperity. And it's getting to the point where one might want to say, this is starting to look kind of like Einstein's definition of insanity. Keep doing the same thing over and over again, expect a different outcome. And I'll just jump ahead. I'll get here. I'll just jump ahead right here. I'll show you going back to 1993. Going back to 1993, all the way through 2024. I should update this. That is 32 years inclusive. This is Site Selection Magazine's Governor's Cup, where they count the number of what they call large investments, usually in manufacturing, add them up and see who had the most investments. And here's Ohio's ranking. We were number one, number two. Oh, we had a bad year for Ohio. Number 5. But you only see like a number 5, and here's a number 4, here's a number 4. But look, we're in the top 3 every year out of those 32 years, except for 3 times. I mean, we're in the top 3, 29 out of 32 years. I mean, we are landing big firms. We are very successful. And as I've already showed you, it's not translating into jobs. Then if you put it kind of just a simple correlation, I could do some fancy statistics, but this is the number of large facility openings per million people. Here's Ohio. We have a lot of large facilities. That's what that's saying. We're out there with Texas, way out here. Here's states that have been growing much faster than Ohio: Indiana, Arizona, Florida. We could get Colorado in here, somewhere fast-growing state. They don't play the subsidy game. And look how much faster they're growing. In other words, one of the things that prompts states to play the subsidy game is that if you're not doing very well, you get desperate. And when you get desperate, you can start doing things that aren't too bright. They're kind of dumb. So that's kind of the background. When I say we're very good, we're doing what we're saying we're trying to do. We're doing it really well. Is it translating broad-based prosperity? No. Here is a look at where we are with our neighbors compared to the U.S. in the last year, and you see, again, the story. All of our neighbors and us are below the U.S. average, and in terms of total job growth, Ohio's growing about half as fast as the U.S. average. Right now, Pennsylvania is the lead of the class of our neighbors. It's still growing a little bit below the U.S. average. In terms of manufacturing, at the moment, in the last 3 years, there have been times when Ohio has been at the bottom of our neighbors. Now we're at the top, but you still 0.3% growth in manufacturing is not very good. Is if your strategy is aimed at helping manufacturing with a particular emphasis on high tech, and you're growing that slow in these industries that you're targeting, you're not going to create a lot of jobs. So, and I'll talk about that. In other words, if you're targeting slow growing industries, you're going to have a slow growing economy. The other feature, though I don't have it here on a chart that's as easily, even with all of this success at attracting new large manufacturing firms, even in manufacturing, if you go back into the 90s, we still trail the US average by about 1/3 below the US average in terms of growth in manufacturing. So even the industry that we're putting so much emphasis on with all these tax breaks, we're still getting, we're still lagging the country. And I'm going to talk about why the distortions that incentives bring to an economy that lead to lower growth, why they don't give us the payoffs that we want. So here's for our neighbors. Columbus, for example, is growing below the U.S. average, 1%. Little bit at the moment, a little bit better than Ohio. We were most of last year below Ohio. In fact, we were below, say, Cincinnati and Cleveland. Now we're a little bit above them. But what I want to notice is that with the exception of Detroit, and this is not going to last with tariffs, they're the only one above the national average. However, if you look at manufacturing, we're doing pretty well, but manufacturing in Columbus at the moment is not a major industry compared to Cleveland or Cincinnati. However, we're doing pretty well. But one of the things that's held us back in the last 3 years is that, and this comes back to, does the Tooth Fairy build large manufacturing facilities, or do they come at the expense of other things we could have had in the economy? So, for example, with the construction of Intel's facility in Licking County, began in 2022. One of the things it did is it hired a lot of construction workers. Well, if you needed somebody to do some construction around your home or a business, or you want a new home building, there was no construction workers, so they were all working at Intel. In other words, that construction wasn't a freebie. It crowded out construction, like new homes and other construction that would have happened if there wasn't that kind of construction activity in Intel. In other words, yeah, we gained some jobs there in construction at Intel, but we lost other construction jobs that we would have had without the Intel. And that had other costs in the economy, because you've heard about the affordable housing crisis. A cause of the affordable housing crisis in Columbus was the lack of construction of residential housing, multifamily housing, and much of that can be pinned on Intel's construction. So coming back to, no, that's not free. When you did that, you gave up home construction. I know you don't know what that is. That's just a quick note for me, just to give you a little perspective. You go back to 1953, which was kind of the real end of the glory era for Ohio. We continued on about 1969, a little below the U.S. average, but before 1953, we were doing great guns. Since 1953, Ohio has gained 82% jobs. The U.S. has gained 219%. So the U.S. is, that's nearly triple the number of jobs. If you go to 1982, when Honda opened up, And I've heard people, that was the greatest thing that ever happened. And it might have been a good investment. However, what I'm going to make my point is that even so, if the point was broad-based Ohio prosperity, we've only grown about 40% in jobs since 1982. U.S. has grown twice as fast at 80%. So even though, Honda being the beginning of Ohio's success at luring new manufacturing based on tax incentives, it is not translated in Ohio necessarily doing very well relative to the rest of the U.S. And this shows, in terms of manufacturing, as I said, we had about 1.1 million manufacturing jobs in 1990. Today, it's in the upper 600,000s. And you can see here's the Great Recession, and this is down, 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 down. And the point is, if you're subsidizing manufacturing and it's shrinking as an industry, you're not going to get broad-based prosperity. Which is one of the important, I'm picking on Ohio politicians now. I could easily pick on politicians in both parties. I have nothing against manufacturing. However, if you're going to target manufacturing as an industry, that means you're targeting an industry that's shrinking. And that means for it to be successful, say for Ohio, we have to be getting a much bigger slice of a shrinking pie. So here shows the share of employment. I borrowed this from Policy Matters. The share of non-farm employment. Manufacturing was about 53% during World War II. Even, like I said, in 1953, nearly half of Ohioans were working in manufacturing. By here, they show by 2014, it's 12%. Today, it's under 10%. Now, less than 1 out of 10, about 1 out of 10 Ohioans work in manufacturing. So, yeah, if you targeted manufacturing in 1950, it was a big industry in Ohio, and it was going to have broad-based spillovers because so many people worked in it in Ohio. Now, if you're targeting manufacturing, it is not the engine it was in 1950. That doesn't mean manufacturing. I don't like manufacturing. I'm not picking on manufacturing. I'm just stating, that's the fact. That's evidence. So, and we're going to get into that with data centers in that targeting a small industry. So, quick rules on how to conduct industrial policy. That's the fancy word at the national level, targeting, firms of the future. We heard that from the Biden administration. The Trump administration, though, does not like the term industrial policy. It's kind of attached with more left-leaning policies, but it's basically the same things. We're going to be manufacturing. So economists have been really skeptical, despite my early enthusiasm. Like I said, back when I wrote my master's thesis, when I was an eager beaver, saying, "Boy, we should be subsidizing semiconductors." That's what I said. And in that era, we had about 40% 35% of the world market, and we have about 12% of the world market in semiconductors. Then our main competitor was Japan. Today, Japan's just an asterisk. Japan was more than us. Today, Japan's an asterisk. The largest country is Taiwan. The point is that this is very dynamic. One of the things, you have to look into the future. And one of the things about, if you look into the future, is semiconductor manufacturing. It's very you need a certain kind of worker that's very low skilled, relatively low skilled. You can do it in Hanoi, which they do. They have a lot of semiconductor plants in Hanoi. It's not fancy kind of work, and it's my dream that would be a good idea. Semiconductors and other high-tech industries in the late 1980s ended up being, it didn't work very well. I disagreed with the Reagan administration, and that, looking at hindsight, the Reagan administration was right. They were right. The free market, we cannot predict the future. We don't know what the future will be. And so in that era, like today, oh, look at what the Chinese are doing. They know what you could just replace China with Japan. Oh, look what the Japanese are doing. Well, Japan made a lot of mistakes because their government picked the wrong industries. So one of their last major mistakes was on high definition TVs. In the early 1990s, they oddly thought that high definition TVs would be really important. They weren't. And Japan picked the technology that ended up not being used. And so, to pick things, you have to be forward-looking. You have to be omniscient. You have to know not only what the best industries will be, but what will be the best industries in the future. And I'll tell you what, has been shown on the stock market pickers get consistently beaten by mutual fund index funds because they cannot predict the future, despite their claims otherwise. So you want large employment, shrinking pie. So if you looked at semiconductors, just because it's like data centers, their employment was around 700,000 in the mid-1980s. In the high-tech boom before the dot-com bust here in early 2000, we had about 300,000. And then you see it has just crashed in the U.S. And one of the things is, since the CHIPS Act, the federal act to subsidize $93 billion for semiconductors, and like Ohio providing large subsidies for that, semiconductor employment actually peaked in late 2022, and it's down 7% since then. In other words, we're putting all this emphasis again on a shrinking industry that's real small. And this industry only employs, I think that's 190,000. 190,000 is barely 0.1% of the U.S. employment. That means if we miraculously as a country doubled our semiconductor employment, another 190,000 jobs, that's only adding another 0.1%. In other words, all those efforts is basically what we get in 1 month. Every month, we could create as many jobs as doubling the size of the semiconductor industry. The same thing, and then here's what basically the numbers I just said. That's the same story, but just more broadly defined semiconductors. Here is data centers. Now, data center employment, because the technology didn't really exist, is been growing. At least it's growing. Today, it's about 150,000 nationally. That is less than 0.1% of the U.S. Again, let's say we triple it. We triple the amount of data center employment across the country. I mean, be wildly optimistic. That would only be 300,000 more jobs. That's less than 2 months of employment growth that we just normally get in the economy. Again, if you could focus on small industries, either they're growing, they're too small to have widespread spillovers. I mean, they're great press releases, but they just don't work. Here, this is a bit of a longer term in terms of manufacturing. All I want to say is the U.S., darker blue, is down about 25% since 2000. Ohio is down since 2000 about 35% in manufacturing. And this is in an era when Ohio was landing large manufacturing facilities at the rate of the best in the country. There's a lot of reasons for that. Why are these things, why aren't they giving us what we think we're getting? And that is, this is what a Canadian economist said. And the economists, this is basically what economists will say. Governments don't know how to pick winners. You've heard that statement. Would you trust the politician to manage your pension fund? Do you trust the politician to be omniscient? That's not what they're trying to, win the next re-election. Governments don't know how to pick what's going to be the next industry, but Losers know how to pick governments. Who wants tax incentives? Who is desperate for tax incentives? Well, I know this is not always the case, but a company like Intel, whose stock is now about 1/4 of the level it was in 2021. Also, anybody in 2022, when we had the groundbreaking for Intel, anybody with any it had been following the industry knew Intel was in trouble. Now, that wasn't a secret. Intel was, is a generation or two behind NVIDIA and others. The other feature is, if you're paying attention to the industry, there was a temporary pop in semiconductor demand because of COVID. Everybody's locked in their house. We all bought TVs and computers and all sorts of things. They needed semiconductors. We had a temporary shortage. Once COVID ended, we quit buying all those consumer goods. Semiconductor demand has gone down. And that's why Intel won't be opening their facility. They promised this year originally. It won't be 2031. And the question is, is there even going to be a market then, if even assuming they keep up in technology? So basically, I want to know, economy, you'd have to agree. Tax incentives are effective. I say, hey, they moved from Ohio. They're effective at moving firms. They get a big enough tax break, you can move firms. However, what they are doing is, in the free market, I've been told I only have 15 minutes, so I better hurry. In the free market, firms would locate where they're going to be the most productive, where they're going to be most profitable. If they're getting tax incentives, the government's intervening, they're getting involved in the economy, those firms are going to move where they would be most productive to where they're less productive. And if we have a lot of tax incentives across the country, we're going to have a lot of firms moving from where they would have been most productive to where they're less productive. So it's widely acknowledged among economists that these things lower GDP. They lower GDP because of that. Subsidies, as I can explain, actually not very hard, but Harvey would not appreciate another 15 minutes. It can be easily shown that they tend to benefit the people who own land. They don't benefit the workers, because if wages get bid up, say here in Columbus, because something's going to happen, new workers will move into Columbus and drive the wage back down to where you started. And in other words, you're not going to get a permanent increase in wages. Likewise, for owners of capital outside of Intel, Kroger or other firms, they're not going to be benefiting only in the short run. In the long run, if there's more demand in Columbus, new grocery stores will open up in Columbus and will drive the returns back down to the national average. So workers and firms don't really benefit. It's the landowners that benefit, because now that land's more valuable because of more economic activity. Also, one of my better papers that I'm really proud of, so we really worked, peer reviewed, we really got causality, really nice paper in my opinion, and that is, we showed that subsidies reduce small business openings by a lot. They reduce small firms, and I told you that's bad, because they disproportionately create more jobs, and they disproportionately have more innovation. So we're crowding out. It's not the tooth fairy. We gave up small business startups and innovation. Even within the semiconductor industry, which we also showed, we didn't know this would happen until we wrote the paper. We showed that even in the industry that you're giving tax incentives, you still crowd out small business openings. The other feature is, this is one of the ironies, politicians are promising jobs, but their tax incentives are subsidizing capital. They're giving incentives to the owners. And the owner, that means they're going to use, if I subsidize capital, they're going to use more capital. And if they use more capital, they're not going to need as many workers. In other words, they're going to use more machines, less workers. So it shouldn't be surprising that subsidizing capital in large firms isn't creating a lot of jobs because we're subsidizing the capital, not the workers. And the other, other features, they create just awful incentives with governments. Just as left-leaning people say corporate welfare, as more conservatives say, I prefer the conservative term, crony capitalism, where the industry, large firms then have a hold. They capture the state and local governments or the federal government, and who will now make decisions not in everybody's interest, but more in that firm's interest. Then the other feature is that that I should mention is something called the winner's curse. That's something economists talk about. It came from auctions. That the person who wins the highest bid on a painting typically overestimates the value of that painting. We see it in sports all the time. We see teams overpaying for Dwayne Watson in Cleveland, if you're a pro football fan, and way overpaying. Winner's curse. The one who wins the competition tends to overestimate, and so we tend to overestimate the benefits of these things. Yeah, that's the winner's curse. And so I hear a lot of people say, "Oh, but we want Intel in Ohio. We don't want that to go to Indiana." Well, let me put it in terms of sports. It wasn't a great deal that we got Dwayne Watson in Cleveland and overpaid for him than what Indianapolis has when they didn't get Dwayne and they have a better team. No, sports fans, we wouldn't have that kind of logic. Overpaying for somebody means we have less money for the other players. So, so given that, I could go on and on. In fact, there's my point about Hanoi. Hanoi's actually a pretty big semiconductor and so forth. So, the last thing I'll say before quickly on data centers, you go back in Site Selection Magazine, they show the winners and the governor, like here's Governor Taft, and here's Governor Strickland, Governor Kasich, Governor Voinovich, Governor DeWine, in other words, showing that they won the competition. Yet, as I said, that's looking at the wrong measure. That's like first downs, not the score. Okay, so let's talk about just quickly, and I know Harvey's going to throw a temper tantrum on me. Let's talk about data centers. Now, talking to people from other states, like Washington State, much faster growing state, they're viewed as kind of a necessary evil. We have to have data centers, but they suck up all this electricity. And that means we have to have a lot more electricity capacity, which is going to have higher rates. And, they use water and, they don't create a lot of jobs. Let other states in their race to the bottom chase that stuff. We don't need that stuff. Like here I have on here, what one of the Minnesota, they're saying, hey, just quit bringing these data centers. These are expensive. And indeed, one of the arguments I'll hear locally in Central Ohio, one is I don't think a lot of economic development, unfortunately, I don't think they really understand the industry, like they didn't understand semiconductors, that what was happening due to COVID wouldn't last forever. And that is, you give a lot of tax breaks and say they end after 15 or 30 years. And I'll hear very naive Ohio economic development officials say that, oh, well, we gave up all these years of tax incentives, but when they end, we'll have this giant tax base. Well, the problem with that is that one, you present discounted value of something 30 years from now is about zero. I mean, 30 years out in the future, you discount that at even a low 3%, it's about zero 30 years in the future. Also, even ignoring discounting, this industry is developing so fast that you're in 30 years or 15 years, they're going to need to completely bring in entirely new technology. They're going to go for another bidding competition Who's going to pay us the biggest tax incentives for us to move? And they're not going to necessarily stay. In fact, they're probably more likely to leave. They're overlooking the fact that the obsolescence of this machinery means that the game 15 years from now is not the game where they're just going to keep it and it's going to be the status quo. It's going to be very different. So we have seen a lot of things. We've seen basically a lot of announcements. We've seen the state. We've seen the local economic development people. Oh, once again, subsidizing large firms, not really understanding that the tooth fairy is not paid for it. It is coming at the cost of either lower taxes for people or less services that could make us more productive. And the other feature about announcements is Microsoft just showed announcements. Boy, the state of Ohio keeps learning this painful lesson. Announcements are not the same thing as actual investment. Microsoft just canceled, I don't know, must have been close to $1 billion worth of investments in Licking County because, well, one is that like the semiconductors with COVID, this AI hype, blah, 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 AI. There's now seems to be a realization that, oh, maybe it's not going to be exactly the way we thought it was going to be. Maybe we don't need all these data centers. Likewise, I mentioned the electricity. I'm actually a little optimistic on that because I think higher electric prices would basically end the data centers, but certainly slow their growth. However, that higher electric prices are not going to help Ohio grow. Likewise, in an era right now, solar energy, we can bring solar online at a relatively low price. However, due to issues, long-running issues with our power grid, which would be a different lecture, you just can't we just can't magically bring it on. So if we want a lot of data centers, that means we're going to have to go back to fossil fuel probably if we get these kind of data centers, and that is a risky investment. I certainly would not want to be making investments in fossil fuel electricity right now. That's not like some heavy-handed regulator. I'm just talking about just simple business risk. It's not a statement whether I believe in climate change or not or something like that. Insurance rates are going up in Florida, and it's crowding out economic activity. And the same with going to more fossil fuel at this moment is not very wise. And overall, we've played a tax incentive game. We're one of the best, but it hasn't led to widespread prosperity. And we need to start realizing in Ohio that the tooth fairy doesn't pay for tax incentives. They are coming at the expense of other things we could have had in the absence of those tax incentives. And in general, the evidence supports you're giving up more growth when you get these large tax incentives than what you're getting. So I will stop there, Harvey, and I'm sorry about being long-winded.
And I'm not going to throw a temper tantrum, but maybe Jordan will, because he has a couple questions from the audience he'd like to get to. So Jordan,
okay,
go ahead and jump in.
I'll try to resist. But yeah, it's a couple good questions here for our last minute before we close out. One, the pandemic revealed that the U.S. doesn't have a local supply of medicines or medical supplies, but that the market doesn't seem likely to fix that. Assuming ensuring local sources of essential medical supplies is a problem we want to solve, are subsidies the right fix for that?
Well, first, Jordan, that gets at one of the things I think that's really misunderstood, and that is you're describing a national problem. If you have a national problem, you shouldn't have a state trying to solve a national problem. I mean, the rest of the country would love it if Ohio gave tax breaks so they get cheaper pharmaceuticals. Like you would love if I'd come over and wash your car, Jordan. But that's not necessarily a good deal for us. That's something that should be done at the national level. It's a national problem. It should be the federal government. We shouldn't be subsidizing the rest of the country and trying to solve that. So, yeah, one could make an argument. However, I would make a different argument, and that is going back to how we won World War II. The federal government built the factories at first, war factories, and brought in the private sector to manage it, turnkey. I would do the same right now. In fact, Elizabeth Warren proposed that, to have government build pharmaceutical factories, because the market is broken down in so many ways, infinite ways on drugs, and that should be done mainly at the federal level. So yes, but not at the state level. So Jordan, I'll just say, I know I'm being long-winded again. Like people were saying incorrectly, we're going to have this big semiconductor shortage. It's bad. We got to have it for defense. Well, if that's true, why is Ohio paying for the defense of the entire country, not the entire country? Okay, sorry, Jordan, go ahead.
Okay, maybe time for one more quick one. So like what are let me see if I can condense this. We have a planner in the audience who's looking at allocating 1% of the land area in their municipality to a data center and are not offering a subsidy. So that's different from the state level policy. But as a land use planner, this seems like a tenuous and fragile gain for sacrificing potentially land use, water, energy use, aesthetic choices. Are there resources that this person or this municipality could use to justify and confidently prioritize this land use based on tax revenue generation alone?
That is something that you're getting at, one of my pet peeves. First, let me just say, here in Central Ohio, wasn't quite your question, but one of the things that this planner or economic development official is doing is basically they're not creating any economic activity. They're just moving it around where it occurs in the metropolitan area. So if I subsidize a data center, or I subsidize a commercial office building or so forth, all I'm doing is subsidizing it, moving it. It might have located in downtown, but now it's going to locate in New Albany. All I did is moved it. Nothing was created, except that we lost. Before we got the tax revenue, now New Albany gave it all away. So one of the things is that these things first should be done be thought more at the regional level, because of these spillovers that communities acting in isolation aren't creating wealth. They're just moving where it happens with the expense of the other problems I mentioned. Yes, in terms of tax revenue, these things could provide an incredible amount of tax revenue. The issue is that right now, there are too many places like Central Ohio who are willing to give away their tax revenue and get that. However, I don't think that's necessarily bad for the community. They have a lot of other alternatives that they could put there instead. They don't have to have a data center. They could have something that's much more pleasing aesthetically, creates more jobs, say with more social benefits than a data center. So my advice is don't say, well, let's pick that data center. My advice is more looking at what's best for your community, not what the hot fad is.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Professor Partridge. I think we're out of time now, so thank you for your thoughts on this issue. And thanks everyone for joining us today. And I want to remind you that we have another webinar series coming up this summer. And our webinar series will address the issue of public data for public good. And this is a webinar series we're organizing with the University Libraries Research Commons. The first event under this theme, which will be May 16th, 2025, is Connecting Communities with Open Civic Data, Roles for Libraries and Civic Data Partners. And we'll hear from Nora Mattern, who's a faculty member at the School of Computing and Information at the University of Pittsburgh. That'll be the first of several events this summer looking at the question of public data for the public good. So hope you join us. See you on May 16th and see you the rest of the summer. And with that, we'll close today's webinar. Thank you for joining us. And thank you, Professor Partridge.